Good evening here on the East Coast, here in New York. I'm Joshua Walker of Japan Society. I'm particularly excited tonight to welcome you to Painting Edo, Early Modern Masterworks from the Feinberg Collection. I want to thank the Talks Plus season sponsor, Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, as well as an anonymous donor, the Sandy Heck Lecture Fund, and Laurel Gonzalez. This program is part of the Richard J. Wood Art Curator Series, which is generously supported in part by an award from the National Association of Japan American Societies with funds from the Japan-United States Friendship Commission. So let me introduce the main speaker for tonight. Before I turn it over to a special guest, we have Dr. Rachel Saunders joining us from Cambridge. She is the Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Curator of Asian Art at the Harvard Art Museum. She earned her PhD from Harvard University in 2015 and is a specialist in medieval narrative and sacred painting. In addition to painting Edo Japanese art from the Feinberg collection you're going to experience today, she also recently curated the exhibit Prince Shotoku, The Secrets Within. Given that this talk focuses on artwork from the collection of Robert and Betsy Feinberg, here at Japan Society, we also have had the privilege of displaying these pieces from the Feinberg's outstanding collection at some of our past exhibits. In fact, we were just talking with the group about this, and so we are incredibly grateful for their support. And obviously, that this is named after a former president here at Japan Society. I'm sitting in the Japan House that was donated by John D. Rockefeller III. There's a lot of strands of connection tonight and makes us feel like we have that kizuna, or deep connection bond of family. So before welcoming Dr. Saunders to the floor or to your screen, and good morning in Ohio to all those in Japan that are joining as well, I'd like to welcome Peter Kelly, our fearless president and leader of the National Association of Japan American Societies, of which we are a proud member, to say a few words, particularly about Richard J. Wood and the Art Curator Series that NAJAS has. Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Joshua, and welcome everyone who's joining. We have a big crowd, I understand, tonight, and we're very pleased to have that. I'm Peter Kelly from the National Association of Japan American Societies. We're located in Washington, D.C. There are 38 Japan American societies all around the country, and the Japan Society in New York is the fourth oldest, dating from 1907, I think, Joshua. The work of the National Association of Japan American Societies is to help provide good Japan-related programming to our members, which they wouldn't otherwise be able to arrange themselves. We began with what's called the Richard J. Wood Art Curator Series with that idea in 2015. The idea was to highlight the importance of art in the U.S.-Japan relationship, beginning in the 19th century and continuing right to now. And we do that by inviting curators of collections of Japanese art at American museums to speak in cities apart from their home museums, to talk about the collections and also about the collectors. Why are there such good collections of Japanese art in American museums? And how important is that in the US-Japan relationship? The series is named for Richard J. Wood, for Dick Wood. Many of you who are familiar with the Japan Society will remember Dick. He was a wonderful man, and he was president of the Japan Society, in addition to many other accomplishments. He was also chairman of the Japan-US Friendship Commission, which helps us, the National Association of Japan American Societies, give this grant. Dick was the brains behind this series. He was a lover of art, and he knew a lot of collectors, and it was he who said, focus on the collections. The collections are the important aspect of art in the US, of Japanese art in American museums. To date, in the Richard J. Wood Art Curator Series, we've done 17 presentations. This year, there are 4. The presentations that have taken place so far this year. Rachel gave this presentation with the Japan American Society of Houston and the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Andreas Marx of the Minneapolis Institute of Art talked about the Murray collection of textiles, and he did that with the support of the Japan American Society of Northwest Florida. And Xiaojin Wu of the Seattle Asian Art Museum spoke at the Japan American Society of Chicago and the Art Institute of Chicago about the remodeling of the Seattle Asian Art Museum and the Richard Fuller collection. The last in this series, after Rachel's presentation tonight, will be Monica Binksik of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and she'll be speaking under a sponsorship of the Japan American Society of Georgia and the High Art Museum in Atlanta on November 19th. So this year will be a good series of collections from different museums in different parts of the country and different kinds of Japanese art. We're all very excited to hear what Rachel will have to say about the Feinberg collection at the Harvard Art Museums. We wish you all could have seen it, and I wish I could have too, but it's been closed for most of its time as an exhibition. So with that, let me welcome you all and turn it back to Joshua to introduce Rachel. Thank you for participating.
Thank you, Peter-san. Let me turn it right over to Dr. Saunders so we can get into what we're, Saunders, I apologize. Make sure we turn right over to you to get into the amazing and stunning collection that you have for us. And I am just so grateful that you've taken the time and that we have this technology to do this. So this is able to enhance the relationship in all areas. So Rachel, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Joshua, for that generous introduction. And I'd first like to express my thanks to you and to the Japan Society for this kind invitation to be with you tonight. My special thanks are also due to Tomomi Sekiya, who's Director of Talks and Programs, and to her team for their persistence and flexibility in bringing this event to fruition in our new circumstances. I'd also like to thank Peter Kelly, who we've just heard from, President of the National Association of Japan-America Societies and the Japan-United States Friendship Commission, for making this program possible. Now, although we're gathered here together in Zoom, and I'm in fact in Providence, Rhode Island, I'd like to start by saying that the Harvard Art Museums acknowledges that Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and that we strive to honor this relationship. Now, as Joshua said, my name is Rachel Saunders, and I'm the curator of Japanese art at the Harvard Art Museums, and I'm the co-curator with Professor Yukio Lippert of the special exhibition Painting Edo, Japanese Art from the Feinberg Collection, which is the cause of our coming together tonight. And although I regret it's not in person, it's really wonderful to be here with a much larger group than would otherwise have been possible, which is one of those Zoom silver linings that we're perhaps getting a little bit used to after 7 months or so, when so many things, including this exhibition, look different in this extended moment of both isolation and change. And I've been increasingly asking myself over this time, for example, how was it that in the Edo period, which was itself so scarred by multiple epidemics, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, famines, and poor governance, that such an enormous wealth of beautiful paintings was produced? And what do they have to say to us today in this moment in 21st century North America? And perhaps that's something we might come back to in the question and answer portion of evenings. I'd certainly like to hear your thoughts. Now, Painting Edo is the largest exhibition in the history of the Harvard Art Museums, and it opened after 5 intensive weeks of installation on February 13th, 2020. And it's now temporarily closed, of course, but you can access its digital avatars through our webpage and our social media. And these now include 9 video tours and a series of events in collaboration with botanists at Harvard's Museum of Trees, the Arnold Arboretum, that we've nicknamed Planting Edo. And I'll come back to those at the end of this presentation. We also have an online exhibition down here, which was produced on Google's platform. And if you enter that exhibition, it looks something like this. It's divided into 4 parts, and you can actually walk through almost the entire exhibition this way online. It looks a little bit like this. Now, in the galleries themselves, we have over 120 works of art from Japan's early modern Edo period, which is usually designated 1615 to 1868, and which was named for the new shogunal capital of Edo, the city that we know today as Tokyo. Now, while the exhibition does offer a history of early modern Japanese painting in 10 rich chapters, as we came to think of them, the more important aim was to attempt to offer an immersive experience of seeing differently. Painting Edo is also a milestone moment in the sharing of a truly remarkable collection of early modern Japanese art. And the paintings in the collection are drawn exclusively from the collection of Robert and Betsy Feinberg. During almost 50 years of collecting, the Feinbergs have always made a point of welcoming scholars and students from all over the world to study their growing collection. And in an act of exceptional generosity, they have now promised their collection to the Harvard Art Museums, making it one of the largest and most significant promised gifts of art ever to be made to this institution. And it's in part for this reason that the exhibition opens with this magnificent painting by Tani Buncho. Titled Grasses and Moon, this enormous window-like ink painting commemorates the harvest moon viewing party that took place on the banks of Edo's Sumida River on the 15th day of the 8th month, just over 200 years ago in 1817, as recorded in the inscription here. On a beautiful night in mid-autumn, the 15th day of the 8th month of 1817, as I wandered the banks of the Sumida River, a clear moon shone as brilliantly as the sun. The scene is rendered here in this true view painted 7 days later. Now, as this audience is well aware, viewing the harvest moon amidst convivial gatherings of friends is a venerable East Asian tradition marked by merrymaking and the composition of poetry, and it's associated with fellowship, for the idea that no matter how far we may be separated from those dear to us, distance alone cannot prevent us all viewing the same moon in the same sky on the same evening. In the painting, the radical proximity of the river reeds, which are rising right out of the very front of the picture plane, and one of which reaches up to just caress the bottom edge of the moon, conveys a powerful sense of bareness. There are no figures painted here. Rather, the vantage point conveys the essence of the experience of being at this gathering and places you, the viewer, on the riverbank gazing up at the moon. Yet the inked image and the oversized painter's seal and the inscription weave this one specific occasion into a communal historical fabric of every other preceding moon viewing party, so that not just the 1817 gathering, but also our own unique experience of this painting converge as a shared memory that echoes across centuries of human experience. And this is certainly a painting whose resonances I at least have felt even more deeply at this year's Mid-Autumn Festival. Now, by 1800, Edo was the largest city in the world, dwarfing contemporary London or Paris with more than 1 million inhabitants. And the early modern era brought an extraordinary wave of urbanization and innovation, stimulating an immense appetite for intellectual and pictorial culture. And a dizzying array of painting schools and lineages was established to meet the demands of traditional aristocratic patrons, as well as the more newly affluent. In the 20th century, scholars have attempted to deal with the pictorial wealth of Edo painting by taxonomizing and evolving a comfortable model for dealing with this abundance through the use of scholarly categories and labels. But over time, this model has been offering gradually diminishing returns. The nature of the Feinberg collection has made it possible for us to begin a re-examination of these categories and to present it instead, as far as possible, on its own terms. To do so, we return to Edo period conceptions of painterly lineage, or ryuha in Japanese, since it seemed to us that it was through membership of school-like lineages, which mirrored the pervasive semi-feudal organization of the Japanese warrior household, that Edo period artists understood their own subjectivity. And it's primarily to these lineages that we have looked in organizing the 10 chapters of the exhibition. The physical layout of the exhibition is designed to welcome and orient the newcomer to Edo art among a representative selection of paintings in an initial lineage gallery. But beyond this, there was no prescriptive route. And the exhibition expanded outward from this central area in 9 additional sections, several of which we're going to visit on our brief tour this evening. Now, the first of these is the Floating World section of the exhibition. Here, we encounter paintings that encapsulate not so much the new and closely regulated urban world of the military city of Edo as experienced day by its inhabitants, but paintings of the new urban fantasy worlds that grew up as spaces for leisure and release within the city, namely the licensed pleasure quarters, which were effectively cities within cities where theaters, restaurants, and bordellos were located. And it was here in these so-called floating worlds, or the ukiyo, that class restrictions could be temporarily restricted. Now, their celebrities were pictured as elegantly dressed fashion leaders, painted against blank backgrounds that invite the viewer to supply the missing narrative, the who and the why and the where, increasing your sense of engagement with the fantasy that's pictured. Now, here, for example, we have a painting of a beautifully dressed woman sitting alone, leaning against some lacquer boxes, and her hair is pinned up in this complex style, and she casually wears several layers of beautifully decorated silk robes that are sort of spilling around her. She holds in one hand a narrow slip of paper, the type of paper that was made especially for writing poems on, and in her other hand, she holds the tip of her writing brush pressed to her lips, so she seems to be thinking about what to write. Above her floats a poem which is written in two columns of Chinese characters. And it can be translated something like this: thinking of you, compelled to compose a verse, under the lamplight, riding through the night of our lost years. Now, it's not clear whether this is a poem from an absent lover to which she's about to respond, or whether this might in fact be her response in the moment before she brushes it on the paper. The poem is playing with the trope of the absent lover, who's usually a scholar official who's been posted to some distant region. But in fact, we can see that this beauty isn't quite alone. If we look carefully, you can see that there's an enormous carp just here, swimming in the lively waters of her outermost robe, looking up at her with these golden eyes. Such paintings of isolated figures evolved out of busy genre paintings like these screens in which many figures are featured. Now, this pair of screens depicts the arrival of the first foreigners in Japan, the Portuguese, in 1543. And a great deal of attention is given to the details of the ship and its crew, as well as its cargo of exotic trading goods. And here we see the procession of the ship's captain into town, with Japanese townspeople inside the storefronts here, peering out at foreigners with their pinkish complexions, their high noses, and their fantastic baggy trousers. In the School of Cordin section, we have works in the globally influential mode of colorful painting, often called rimpa, which was produced by painters who followed in the footsteps of the 17th century painter named Ogata Cordin. It was works like these that, when they arrived in Europe in the late 19th century, spurred the development of movements like Art Nouveau, for example. Now, School of Cordin painting is distinctive for its extravagant use of beautiful mineral pigments and precious metals to expand delicate classical literary motifs into often impressively immersive new images. This pair of folding screens depicting flowering plants of the four seasons, arranged from spring at the right through summer, fall, and winter as we move through to the left, for example, in fact, also offers the viewer several notional pathways through which to move in this virtual garden. In the mind of the educated Edo period viewer, each plant would also have conjured up a whole range of seasonal poetic associations as they metaphorically walked through the garden. And this remarkable screen of autumn maples is one of my very favorites in the exhibition. Again, the cut-off tops of the trees beg you to complete the picture in your mind's eye, transporting you to the grove and channeling your vision along an inward-leading path that really kind of conveys a subtle sense of depth, even in a painting which is executed upon a flattening, reflective surface of gold foil. And while the painting style is not what we would describe as botanically realistic, again, we do find that the essence of the plant is captured. In the top left corner, for example, here, these two tiny leaves that just seem to flicker at the corner of your vision in the top left-hand corner of the screen here, and also in the lichen-like texture of the tree trunks, which is produced by dripping wet ink into wet ink to achieve this, this puddling effect here. And moving on into our eccentricity section, here we feature the works of painters considered to be brilliantly eccentric or strange in the true Edo period sense of the word, or ki, as well as powerful works by painters who were dubbed eccentric by 20th century scholars. So here we have a really remarkable screen painting depicting an incident from the 14th century war epic, The Tale of a Heike, in which the warriors Kagesue, who's on the left in red, and Takatsuna, who's on the right in green, compete to be the first to cross the river Uji, after enemy Minamoto warriors have abandoned their position and wrecked the bridge on their way out. Although Kagesue is initially in the lead, Takazuna tricks him by telling him that his horse's girth strap appears to be loose, whereupon Kagesue looks down to check, and Takazuna overtakes him. Now, this extraordinary rendering of this well-known incident is by the painter Soga Shohaku, who's one of several overlooked Edo painters who, perhaps because they did not belong to a particular lineage, never quite made it into the canon until they were written into it in the 20th century as eccentrics or kijin. And you can see why. The grotesque musculature and fangs of the horses and the mask-like faces of the warriors, the wild waveforms, and the really extreme use of color all feed very easily into a narrative of eccentricity, in which eccentricity is understood as a personal psychological state, as we in the 21st century understand it. However, this is in fact somewhat anachronistic. The concept of ki was very well established, and in Edo Japan was much closer to something like the affective genius, or being so accomplished and so natural that one failed to observe mundane norms. Ike no Taiga, the painter of the other pair of screens in this gallery, was celebrated as one who was filled with the true essence of ki. And in this pair of screens, he paints two Chinese poets who were also considered to embody ki. The first, showing you here, is Meng Jia, a 4th century Chinese poet who failed to notice when his cap was blown off by a gust of wind at a formal gathering one day. And when a colleague criticized his appearance, he replied with a beautifully phrased poem composed on the spot. And you can see his boy attendant in the left-hand corner of the screen here, so chasing after his lost hat right here. The other is Su Shi, an 11th century scholar about whom many anecdotes survive, including this one, in which the eminent scholar courtier is caught out one day on a walk by a sudden rainstorm. And so what to do? With utter disregard for etiquette, Su knocks on the door of a peasant farmer's home and borrows a pair of rustic high clogs to get him through the mud and a broad-brimmed farmer's hat to protect him from the rain. And so here he is at the height of ridiculousness for a Sung courtier, happily dressed in farmer's clothing. Now, the painting itself is made to appear as if it were painted quickly, or eccentrically, if you will, with fast, wide brushstrokes, and it's spattered with taisha, which is a red-brown pigment, here and there. But in fact, the composition is very carefully planned and balanced, with one poet facing us and the other facing away. One poet wearing a hat and the other unhatted. One poet in the company of a deciduous tree, while the other is with a conifer. And by juxtaposing these two examples of eccentricity in the gallery, what we were really trying to do was to make visible one of the starting points for the rationale of the exhibition in our revisiting of the categories of Edo painting. And this is something that really was only made possible by the breadth and depth of the Feinberg collection. Now, there are two sections in the exhibition that are devoted to supposedly amateur painting in the mode of the scholarly gentleman who painted not for money, but as part of a lifestyle that shunned the benefits and comforts of the mercantile world for the integrity of reclusion away from the world. These men, or often called literati, would instead devote their time entirely to self-cultivation through reading, writing poetry, practicing calligraphy, and painting. As amateurs, their materials were meant to be modest, usually just ink and paper, and their subjects, idealized Chinese landscapes and symbolic plants, for example, were ideal for contemplation. Their paintings were not officially for sale and instead circulated as gifts between friends. It's, of course, a mode of painting with a venerable history in China that was adapted in Edo Japan to the archipelago's different social conditions, more as an aesthetic style than as a political position. Now, the term literati painting, which is a translation from the word bunjinga, has most often been applied to describe the work of both first wave early Edo painters in this mode and their later followers. The term, however, obscures the quite distinctive differences between what we might call the vanguard first generation of painters in this mode and their later followers. In the exhibition, we decided to try and highlight that development by separating painters often grouped together under the term literati into two groups, with earlier practitioners gathered in a section called pictorial culture, and later practitioners, many of whom were in fact more or less openly painting in exchange for money, in a second section, which we titled Professional Amateurism, to reflect the idea that although they espoused the aesthetics of supposedly amateur painting, they painted professionally in exchange for money. So in the pictorial cultivation section of the exhibition, we have juxtaposed, for example, the work of father and son painters Uragami Gyokudo and Uragami Shunkin, who were both relatively early exponents of Chinese-style literati ink painting in Japan. Gyokudo's microcosmic landscape here is, take a closer look. It's really composed out of a frenzy of fast-moving dry brushstrokes that create a landscape in which the element that you would expect to be moving, let's take an even closer look. The element you expect to be moving would be the traveler, the figure of this male traveler here, is in fact still, while it's the landscape around him that shimmers. Gyokudo's son Shunkin, by contrast, expands his extraterrestrial landscapes to monumental scale to inhabit this immersive format, the Japanese folding screen here. And despite the difference of scale, again, expectations are confounded, as it's not the placid water, really, that's moving here. It's the towering rocks, which appear to be cresting and almost overwhelming the viewer. It's good to remember while we're in Zoom that if you were viewing this in person, it's about 5'5" tall, and you would be seated on the ground. So you would feel almost as if you were in this landscape. Now, included among the later professional amateurs who produced literati-style paintings on commission are painters like Yamamoto Baitsu, who began depicting domestic Japanese landscapes and adding color and precious metals to these very popular works, as in the case of this pair of screens, which depict two Japanese beauty spots near the city of Kyoto. Arashiyama on the right, famous for its riverside cherry blossoms in spring, and Mount Takao on the left, famous for its autumn maypoles. Now, while the sites have been celebrated as timeless beauty spots in Japanese poetry for centuries, Edo period painters like Baitsu began to invest them with familiar contemporary vignettes, like these scholarly men here who are sitting outdoors enjoying a picnic, and an attendant right here who's busily collecting autumn mushrooms. The final gallery of the exhibition is devoted to fan paintings, which are represented unusually strongly in the Feinberg collection. And as you can see, there are folding fans on ribs, which were used for a variety of purposes, including as accessories, as gifts, and in dances and rituals of various kinds. Particularly precious painted fans might be removed from these ribs and preserved as hanging scroll paintings, as you can see at the bays at each end of this wall here. And there are also fan paintings which were never destined for utilitarian use, but which remain flat so that they could be pasted to decorative folding screens. And on this wall, we arranged two sets of fans painted with seasonal flowering plants together in an arrangement that runs from spring to winter, from right to left, in a contemporary analog of a traditional ogi nagashi, or floating fans composition, something like this. And the idea is that the floating fans format it's rumored to have had its origins in the practice of gathering on a bridge to celebrate the end of the heavy heat of summer and the relief of the beginning of autumn by elegantly disposing of one's summer fan by tossing it from the bridge so that these beautiful objects might float away together in an exquisitely poignant cluster. And so we were trying to present a contemporary analog of that practice. Now, before we close, I just wanted to say a little bit about teaching in the museums, which, integral as they are to Harvard's campus, is a vital part of our practice as a university museum. There are a whole range of things that we do which go on both within and beyond the walls of the museum, and that could be the subject of a different talk. But for starters, a good deal of specialized teaching goes on here in our purpose-built art study center on the 4th floor of the museums, which is a suite of 5 classroom spaces for teaching with original works of art. In the last year, we had almost 35,000 works of art go through that space, which is many times the number we could ever show in the galleries. But instead, the works are actually in action here in the Art Study Center. Of course, those operations are currently temporarily suspended. But in relation to this exhibition in particular, teaching was integral to its planning and its execution. Yukio Lippert and I began with a seminar on Edo painting, which was dedicated to works in the Feinberg collection in the fall of 2017. And this really allowed us to focus on the collection and key questions that we wanted to address, so to begin to work through the exhibition catalog, which is the publication at the top here with the peacock on the cover. And it was also here that graduate student participants began researching and drafting entries for the catalog raisonné of the collection, which is a separate publication below with the maples on the cover here, which covers the entire collection of over 300 works. And this is scheduled for publication at the very end of this year. Now in the seminar, in the course of the seminar, we made a number of visits to the Feinberg's home to study the paintings in person here. And here are a couple of snapshots of that happening. Several graduate students then worked with me on parts of the exhibition and the planning process. Helen Swift, who has a particular interest in fan paintings, worked with us to create the fan wall that you've just seen. And Leah Justin Hinich, who's particularly adept with movie making software, managed to turn her in-person tours of the exhibition into online video tours following the shutdown in March. And you can now see these tours on our website or on our Vimeo channel. Additionally, while there is, of course, no replacement for time with the actual objects, we've been very fortunate since we shut down to have been able to work with some of our campus partners on some new initiatives, one of which has been to present some joint programs with staff from Harvard's Museum of Trees, the Arnold Arboretum. Now, in these programs, we've been able to bring together some other ways of seeing differently, bringing to bear the eyes of a botanist and a curator on both painted and planted trees and flowering plants that are represented both in the exhibition and in the grounds of the Arboretum. Now, physically located 5 miles apart, these are programs that would have been impossible in person, but which the COVID era has hastened into being. And the results have been something of a surprise hit, with hundreds of participants from around the globe each time. And I wonder if perhaps one of the draws is that each time we do this, it's the curators just as much as the audiences who get to see differently. These programs have really underlined the importance of bringing multiple perspectives to bear on our looking and experiences in what is, after all, an art museum and not an art history museum. And the path-breaking botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer captures in her 2013 book, Braiding Sweetgrass, an imaginary conversation that has been on my mind recently. Now, that conversation is between Nanabozo, the Anishinaabe culture's original man, and the 18th century Swedish botanist Linnaeus, in which she pictures them walking together and naming all the living beings. And as they do this, Linnaeus lends Nanabozo a magnifying glass so that he can see the tiny floral parts of the plants. And in return, Nanabozo gives Linnaeus a song so that he can see their spirits. And in that exchange, neither of them are lonely any longer. Now, if in these joint programs we could be capturing even just a little of that sort of synergy, it feels as though we could be making a positive contribution towards seeing differently in ways that we certainly hadn't foreseen prior to March 2020. And if you care to, you can follow those events on our various Instagram and social media accounts like this. I hope you will join us for some of those as they come up in the future. So thank you for your company on this virtual tour today. I hope it's given you at least a taste of the exhibition while the physical doors remain closed. And in the meantime, if you're so moved, the exhibition catalog is available. You can order it if you would like from Yale University Press. And please do look out for new information, further information on upcoming events and online content on our webpage to help you access the museums and the exhibition from home. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Saunders, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you all who's joining us for this virtual program. I'm Tomomi Sekiya, Director of the Talks Plus program at Japan Society. At this point, we would like to take some questions from the audience. We've been compiling questions from the chat, so we will start with those and some questions we received in advance. So if you have anything you would like to ask Dr. Saunders, please enter your question in the chat now. And Dr. Saunders, the first question for you is, the original exhibition had to close only a few weeks after opening, but you have said that it will reopen when things return to normality. What will the exhibition look like when it reopens?
That is such a good question, and it sounds like a simple question, and it, of course, is very much not a simple question in this changed moment that we find ourselves in. So the exhibition was open for about just over 3 weeks, and then we had to close in the middle of March. And although we don't have a hard date for reopening, it's projected that we may be able to reopen in January. And the exhibition will be extended, so we will reopen with this exhibition. In terms of what it will look like, the installation itself, it was an entirely custom installation designed to be as sympathetic as possible to the paintings and their particular needs. And as you're very well aware, I know the Japan Society mounts wonderful exhibitions, beautiful exhibitions yourself. So knowing what that takes in a museum setting it's quite an undertaking. And our designer, in fact, I took him to Japan so that he could really understand what these paintings needed and how best practice in Japan, what that looked like. So we had an entirely custom made installation for this exhibition. It was really pretty extraordinary. That was the upside. The downside of having a custom made installation is that it's immovable. So although a long period of time has elapsed since we closed, we're not actually able to make physical changes to the exhibition. So that leaves us in a position where the changes that we would want to make, the things that we'd want to see, the way that we might want to reframe the exhibition slightly differently now that we have passed through these many months of COVID and turbulence in many parts of society. That means that it will not be in the physical installation. It will be in the programming that we have to make our changes, that we make our interventions in how the exhibition looks now. And so we've replanned programs for the upcoming spring to just sort of really change the emphasis a little to reflect the fact that things do look different now. So we are, for example, retooling our symposium so that it won't be an in-person event anymore, but it will be spread out over a longer period of time, and we'll be able to invite colleagues from Japan to join us in Zoom, which we would have been unable to do previously. So that's an important addition to our programming. We're also releasing, we've been busily making some behind-the-scenes videos to really sort of increase the transparency around the show, what it was that we were thinking and how we went about doing it. And one of those is a video that's been made by our designer, really going into the design process and his thinking process in putting together the installation for the exhibition. Installation design is something that often doesn't really, it gets talked about. I mean, the minute anybody walks into a museum, everybody becomes an architecture critic. I'm sure you're familiar with that sort of sensation, but it's something that often is just taken as a given, and we don't hear a lot about the design decisions that are made, but design is really our interface with the world. So it's incredibly important to be able to be transparent about what we were trying to achieve with our particular installation. So we've created a video that really sort of details that kind of process. We're planning some new events, some different kinds of talks, and some tours with other types of emphasis than we might have made previously. I'm keen to talk about ink painting as a mode of resistance and resilience, for example, and really to have a look at Edo's globalism, its relative globalism, as opposed to the feeling that's often sort of perpetuated that it's an isolated region and it's this sort of peaceful era. In fact, as I said at the very opening of my presentation, there were many famines and uprisings and earthquakes and all kinds of events that people faced. And really one of the questions that haunts me is, against that kind of a background, how was it and why was it that such diversity and rich masses of paintings such as those that have survived into the Feinberg collection were created at this time? So that's something that I'm keen to think about now.
Yeah, it's such a shame and so devastating, that happened to all the art community. But it's great to hear that you guys are trying to make the best of it and doing like a Zoom seminars and everything, inviting Japanese guests. And I'm very looking forward to the reopening.
Absolutely.
The next question, for someone interested in building a collection of traditional Japanese art, how do you recommend storing and displaying pieces such as hanging scrolls and folding screens?
It's a great question. So I think there are a lot of different ways of thinking about this, and museum climate control in the West is one way of thinking about it. Climate controlled storage is definitely one philosophy, but often conservators will say that when it comes to Japanese paintings, the important thing is not so much that having that sort of state-of-the-art storage. Of course, you want proper and safe storage, but the important thing is to maintain consistency in the levels of humidity, heat and cool, dryness, wetness, this kind of thing. So having a consistent atmosphere is the important thing. In terms of storage, Japanese paintings go with their native mode of storage. I mean, they're created with these often custom-made boxes, boxes within boxes even, that create these incredible microclimates that are really the safest places for these paintings to live and even to travel. Screens generally to be kept, to be stored, at least to be stored folded up and standing. So I hope that's helpful. One of the wonderful things about Japanese paintings, hanging scroll paintings, is how compact they become when they're rolled up and they're placed in their boxes. It's always shocks my colleagues in European and American art how many paintings we are able to store in one place.
Well, that's an interesting question and answer. Thank you. And the next question is, what was the relationship between the creation of poetry and the paintings in the Edo period? Great question.
Great question. Big question. Very big question. There are a lot of ways you could go about answering that. I think that one of the really interesting things about that relationship is that Japanese poetry and Japanese painting, so the making of images, making of visual images using verbal images and vice versa, has an incredibly long history, a very well-established history. And you start to see a really interesting shift in that in the Edo period with the advent of the popularity of haiku poetry. So this kind of relationship is established, 11th, 12th century, perhaps even earlier, with the relationship between waka or classical poetry and images that sort of arise out of the practice of waka poetry. But by the time we're moving into the Edo period, we're starting to see the popularity of the very sort of short format haiku poem, which I've heard likened to the taking of a selfie in some ways, that just sort of capturing that little moment of something. And that's a very different mode of perception than sort of drawn out, storied, historied, overdetermined waka poetry. And you start to see a different poetic vocabulary coming out of that new dynamic. It's almost as if the haiku poetry, the invention of haiku poetry and its practice produces a new vocabulary that makes its way back into painting as well. So it's not always the case that poems are literally inscribed on paintings, although they often are. But one of the very interesting things that I do think happens is you start to see this new vocabulary appearing in Japanese paintings, even without its poetic, even without poetic inscription. So in the exhibition, we have a cycle of 12 paintings by the painter Sakai Hoitsu, which are paintings of the birds and flowers of the 12 months, which is a very, very old classical theme, goes way, way back to the sort of 13th century or so, when established pairings of birds and flowers were set out in a group of waka poems by Fujiwara Teika, and those birds and those flowers were forever associated with those months going forward. But by the time we get to Sakai Hoitsu painting birds and flowers of 12 months in the 1820s, he's not using those birds and flowers anymore. He has sort of evolved his vocabulary, and his birds and flowers are the birds and flowers that are native to haiku poetry. So they're often actually much more familiar and everyday. And in that context, they're very surprising to come across in painting. So they're very fresh. And they're, in a way, you could read them as painted poems as much as you can read them as observations of the way that plants grow and the way that birds and insects behave. Is that
Interesting. I've never heard anybody referring it as like selfie in the Edo period. Maybe it was like an Instagrammer.
There's a little bit like Instagram. It's just that little moment that you want to convey, and then somebody else, grabs onto it, and you get a sort of whole chain reaction of new images that say something, maybe not using words, but just using images. A very visual mode of communication.
That actually makes a lot of sense. The next question. Okay, to this day, the changing of seasons is still celebrated in Japan. What was distinctive about how Japanese people interacted with nature, and why was it a focal topic for Japanese artists during this time?
Another great question. I hesitate to make generalizations about this, but natural subjects, it's not just the Edo period that is dominated by the painting of natural subjects. That's something that goes back a very, very long way. And in fact, bird and flower painting is one of the three major genres of East Asian painting, the others being landscape. And then figures really sort of coming in last, I would say, which is, for a Western audience, that's an interesting and striking phenomenon, because often when we think about Western painting, we're thinking about a very sort of human-centric world where we tend to see, especially in pre-modern painting, we tend to see reflections of what we think we should be seeing, a sort of attempt at representation of photorealistic depiction, whereas that's definitely not the baseline for Japanese painting, certainly not in the Edo period. We get multiple sort of roving perspectives, and perspectives that have led people to speculate as to whether they might actually be not human perspectives, but God's eye perspectives sometimes, or other phenomenon like that, to sort of explain why we're not seeing what we think we should see as human beings. In terms of why these things might have been painted, I'm especially thinking about this during the difficulties of the Edo period, when people were facing incredible hardships and difficulties. And I wonder, in this moment where we're also sort of unusually isolated and restricted, whether they may have magnified the meaning of the natural world and man's place within it in some way that was comforting, in a sense of order, or sort of some sense of being ordained in some way or other. Maybe man is seen as just being part of the natural world rather than in a sort of controlling role. That's something that people have speculated about. I don't know how I feel about making a generalization like that, but I think more comfortable I would be thinking about the role of auspicious imagery and the role of paintings in bringing auspicious imagery into a space. When you think about folding screens, for example, they're they're so enormous, and they're used as kind of temporary walls to reconstruct spaces, not only reconstruct space, but to influence the atmosphere and the environment and change that space for whatever purpose you might need, whether it's a social gathering or a ritual, for example. And I can't help wondering whether that that desire to bring in auspiciousness through imagery isn't one of the things that influences the real sort of preponderance that we see in surviving Edo painting of what we call natural subjects. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I believe so. Okay, the next question. I find the topic professional amateurism interesting. Does this indicate that painting was already a realm limited to quasi-elite experts in the Edo era?
Yes, I think so. I think the idea of the amateur is very deceptive from sort of point of view of 21st century human beings. If we think about where it comes from, it's a sort of self-deprecating mode of saying that I'm an amateur because I'm not a professional. And that doesn't mean that I'm not good at something. It just means that I'm not doing it for a living. And so it's coming out of this ultimately sort of a history that you can chase back to continental China of political resistance, in a way, a sort of a refusal of the qualified, refined scholar official to serve his government when he deems his government to be corrupt or lacking. The move is to withdraw yourself from service, to sacrifice your living, and to take yourself away, to be a recluse, to study, to paint, to write poetry, and to preserve your integrity until the time is such that a righteous ruler returns and you can return to service. So that's the sort of the trope that's coming from China. That's where the amateur comes in. It's a man who does other things too. In terms of painting in Japan, the situation in China and the situation in Edo Japan was so vastly different. The big difference is that Edo Japan did not have an official scholar official class. So there were no people who fell into that social class to make that move. But there were people who wanted to paint in this so-called amateur or Southern style. And so it comes in more as an aesthetic mode. And we looked at a couple of paintings by the Uragami Gyokudo and Shunkin, the father and son team. And they're some of the earlier painters, and they're perhaps more affiliated with the Chinese trope of the reclusive ink painting gentleman, in that Gyokudo was supposed to have given up his official position at the age of about 50. He was a bureaucrat, gives up his salary, and takes his two sons and goes on the road with his Chinese zither and plays his zither and paints in return for hospitality, so say. So that's if that's a story we have to take with perhaps a grain of salt, but it's certainly a projection of someone who's behaving very much as an amateur gentleman painter. But by the time we get to people like Yamamoto Baitsu and his group, we're seeing that this kind of amateur painting, this aesthetic, has become so desirable that people want to commission it, and people who are not in these circles, people who are not living as these so-called gentlemen recluses, and so they want to pay for these paintings. And there becomes a space for people to become professional amateurs, and for sure they are at this point absolutely specialized. Baitsu and his friend Chikito supposedly traded off subjects even. Baitsu was supposed to do the birds and the flowers and the insects, and Chikito was supposed to do the landscapes. And again, it's an apocryphal story probably, but the interesting thing is that a story, an anecdote like that was perpetuated and has persisted to this day. So certainly, I think we could think about these painters as being quasi-elite experts, as the person asking the question
Yes, thank you for the question. The answer is yes, it is.
I think so. Yeah, very long yes.
Okay, the next question. Does the Feinberg collection have any works that had to be moved from a screen because the screen was falling apart? For example, from a screen to hanging scroll.
Not that I'm aware of. One of the remarkable things about the collection is the incredible condition that it is in. So if any of those works have been transplanted across media, it's happened either it's happened before they have come into the collection. We do know there's a couple of works in the collection that appear to be sketches or preliminary sketches that were prepared prior to a full painting being produced. And those sketches have been conserved. One of them is by Maruyama Okyo. It's a very large waterfall sketch, very lifelike waterfall. And it looks from the type of paper that it has been painted on and the joins of the paper, the sort of size of the paper, that this is actually a sketch that was then, that was later mounted on a 2-panel folding screen and had some gold dust added to it as well. So there are a few works like that, but we haven't had any, we don't know of any works in the collection that have been translated more recently.
Great. Yes, and as Dr. Walker mentioned in the beginning, we have borrowed some of the collections for our exhibitions too. So it's really well known how wonderful their collections are.
I have to say, I remember seeing the Portuguese ship arriving in the harbor at the Japan Society during the Sugiyama exhibition, and it really Sugimoto exhibition really was wonderful.
It was beautiful, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question. Was the peacock painting influenced by Western art or culture?
Oh, it's a good question. The peacock painting, because of its subject, I guess, to me still looks very exotic, but it's often the question that people ask about that painting is, is there Western influence on it? And I think that the answer is certainly yes, in that although we have this very sort of typically traditional polychrome background with the amazing peonies, very luscious peonies here, and then we have this sort of also very standard rock formation. It's got some ink texture strokes and some moss dots, things that are very distinctive to Asian painting. The peacock itself has a sense of lifelikeness that is unusual, and I would think would have been very novel at the time. You see its neck, for example, twists in such a way that it implies a musculature underneath those feathers and a sense of depth as well. And I think it's less about capturing the superficial appearance of the bird in massive detail, although the painting is very detailed. I think it's more about capturing that sense of lifelikeness, which comes in with this very sort of delicate balance between the surface detail and something that's more ineffable, something that is more difficult to describe. It's maybe more about the experience of looking, what you imagine looking at a real peacock might be like, and having the feeling that that's coming back out of the painting at you in some way. It's a very sort of subtle distinction, but there's definitely something there that's extremely arresting. It's very difficult to tell from the photograph, but actually in the tail feathers, around the eyes of each of the peacock feathers, there are these little tassels, trailing tassels, filaments of feathers that are in gold, and that's something you only really see when you get close to the painting and you move. One of the questioners earlier on, I didn't quite address this, was how would you recommend displaying paintings like this? And I would say, firstly, occasionally, so not all the time. They're not meant to be left up for long periods of time. But the other thing is that daylight, although it's something that museums avoid because of its damaging nature, moving daylight will change the way you see your painting. in a way that you just can't really achieve in a gallery setting where the light is very homogeneous and very stable. And so if you are moving, or if the light is moving and you are face to face with this painting and there's no glass between you and the painting, you're going to see things that you definitely will not experience in a photograph, in a Zoom presentation, or even in a museum gallery with the best will in the world. Those things are still slightly ineffable.
I suppose that's a perk, working in the museum.
It's a great privilege indeed. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I will have to make this the last question. Where can I get the Painting Edo and the Feinberg collection catalogs?
Oh, that's a great. I love that question. They are. So the exhibition catalog is available, and that's you can order that from Yale University Press. They have a website. Or you can go to the other place that we all know about, and it should be available there too. The collection catalog will be available, I hope, at the very end of this year, or possibly in January, depending on the circumstances. But that is, we've just signed off on the final proofs, so that is on its way out to us soon. And again, it's coming from Yale University Press. So if you're particularly keen, you can go and take a look there and place your orders there. Thank you for the question.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Saunders, for your answers to those questions. And thank you again to everyone who has joined us from all over the world. And we apologize if we didn't have time to get to your question. And if you are interested in Edo period art, we encourage you to watch Edo Avant-Garde, a documentary. This is streaming on Japan Society's website through January. And Dr. Saunders will also join the director for Q&A session. I believe we will post a link to the event page on the chat. And if you have a moment, please fill out a short survey about this program. You can find the link in the description as well as in the chat. We appreciate your feedbacks and hope to see you again at future Japan Society programs. Thank you and good night.